Yes, hello. This is Leonard Pickard. It's my pleasure to interview on this JLS podcast the distinguished and inimitable Bryan Hubbard, JD, Director of the American Ibogaine Association. Bryan was just on Joe Rogan, certainly inspiring. He is almost evangelical in his support of Ibogaine therapy. We are personally acquainted and good friends. So this is, while inquiring, not overly aggressive, although there may be some difficult questions. So it's my privilege to introduce to you my dear friend, Bryan Hubbard. Hi, Bryan.
Hi, Leonard. Thank you for the kind introduction, and it is a joy and a privilege to know you.
As it is for me, Bryan. So after the Rogan interview, which millions watched, there are some spin-out questions based on that interview, some things that follow-up questions, and we'll begin to go through a few of those and just take it away. Speak from the heart, as I know you always do. So on Joe, you shared how your dedication to Ibogaine advocacy occurred, and looking back now, what do you think in your life was the most pivotal moment that convinced you that this Ibogaine effort was worth risking your career and honorable reputation over? What made you take that? What moment made you take that great risk?
Well, I would have to say that it was the time at which I accepted the job of chairman of the Kentucky Opioid Commission, because my job was to figure out how we could generate unique progress with one-time, non-recurring settlement money from the folks who created and perpetuated the opioid epidemic in Kentucky and elsewhere to try to solve the problem. And at the time I took the job, I said the most important thing that we needed to do was to take a small portion to pursue research and development around a therapeutic breakthrough for opioid dependency. And I told them I didn't know what that was, but that we needed to look for the moonshot opportunity that could make Kentucky a national leader in recovery and redemption instead of tragedy. I spoke with Juliana Christina, was her pen name. She wrote a Substack publication called The Journey, and she was the first individual to say the word Ibogaine to me. I'd never heard about it in my life. And then she in turn connected me to a lady named Juliana Mulligan, who had had a 10-year heroin addiction story related to opioids. And after I heard Juliana's story, in particular how Ibogaine saved her life when nothing else would, it was then and there that I made the internal commitment to do whatever I could to make Ibogaine a medical reality within the United States.
Well, thank you, Bryan. That's that pivotal moment, so very well characterized. Individual who was suffering greatly and had undergone this therapy was the convincing individual. A single woman's report led you to change your path and go on this great crusade. And then, of course, your own personal experiences. If you could completely design specific regulatory reforms opposing, say, current federal scheduling and pharmaceutical big pharma interest, what specific regulatory reforms would you prioritize if you could design policy from scratch?
Well, as you know, as long as something is Schedule 1, there is an incredibly complex to conduct legitimate scientific and medical research with Controlled 1 substances. For every clinical indication or for every condition for which one may wish to develop a Schedule 1 substance, you have to conduct your own independent FDA drug development trial, which costs hundreds of millions of dollars. Because of the multidimensional nature of what Ibogaine can potentially do for addiction, trauma, and other neurological conditions that impact the brain, rescheduling so that we can expedite scientific and medical research while conducting basket trials that would allow the deployment of Ibogaine for multiple conditions within a single trial framework to economize both time and resources is imperative. Not only would I have it rescheduled expeditiously, but the FDA process itself is one which seems to cry out for reform. When we have real life data by the thousands of people in clinics that operate offshore from the United States that can properly inform this bureaucracy as to both safety and efficacy for multiple clinical indications, that data should be considered, should have relevance, and should help shorten the timeline for medicalization. Ultimately, the big picture reality is that government needs to get with reality. Theoretical legal frameworks that have been constructed with mixed motivation need to give way to expedited, judicious medicalization of a therapeutic that, under the current system, will see hundreds of thousands of people suffer and die before it becomes available. And as we execute the process through the system that we have, any opportunity to take a sledgehammer to legal barriers that exist for no rational reason other than to thwart progress need to be demolished with vigor.
Thank you, Bryan. I have to say that, and to our audience as well, Bryan is one of the most extraordinary individuals I've ever met, and certainly the most extraordinary in the last several years. You rarely see today the type of enthusiasm. I think of Steve Jobs' reality distortion field when Steve really believed something was going to happen. It just the mental force would generally make it happen. And Bryan is very much like Steve Jobs. So in the Rogan interview, you spoke very passionately about veterans who are struggling with addiction, but also you said, quote, moral injury, unquote. So how do you see Ibogaine or psychedelic therapy addressing that dimension beyond simple detoxification? How does it address moral injury?
According to individuals who have received Ibogaine, whether they are within military service or not, individuals who have had trauma experiences in which they have found themselves compelled to have experiences based on the force applied to their trauma circumstance, a lot of folks carry around a tremendous amount of both guilt and shame over what they have experienced for reasons that don't necessarily lend themselves to scientific quantification. An Ibogaine experience not only impacts the physiology of the mind and body, but it reaches into that intangible attribute that we each carry, and that is the human soul, the psyche, the heart of who we are. And oftentimes, and in most cases, an Ibogaine experience can take an individual who carries paralyzing degrees of guilt and shame and release them from that. I received a letter just 2 days ago from a military wife whose husband has been suffering from post-traumatic stress and alcoholism for 21 years. He was the lone survivor out of a group of 13 Marines, 12 of whom were instantaneously killed by an IED while he was in service. He heard the Rogan interview and went for an Ibogaine treatment. And within his internal journey, he saw his deceased teammates, and they all gathered around him and told him that they were doing just fine, that they were exactly where they wanted to be, that he needed not feel any further guilt or shame about the fact that he survived, but that God intended for him to experience a life of joy and to live well into his old age with the capacity to always honor and rejoice for his lost brothers. And according to his wife, the response to that experience has been nothing short of miraculous. So that's a real life example of what this divine medicine can do by way of producing absolution and release for the individual in prison by guilt and shame.
Thank you, Bryan. That's a transformative experience. What brave men, not only in the battlefield, but in the battlefield of the soul after their difficult experience in the theater.
Yes, sir.
So in the podcast, Rick Perry, whom we met at Aspen, and who spoke most earnestly about his own experiences and his effort to pass the bill in Texas, was also at MAPS on several occasions. So Rick Perry joined you on the Rogan podcast, and he spoke that this was a truly bipartisan issue. And so that division, have you encountered the resistance from Republicans and Democrats? Have you, both sides of the aisle, have you encountered pushback from Democrats, for that matter? How do you bridge those divides between both sides of the aisle?
The support for the Ibogaine initiative, primarily in Kentucky where it began, was bipartisan, as was the opposition. Interestingly, in Texas, there was broad bipartisan support in both chambers of the legislature and in all quarters where there were voices that had partisan relevance in a political process. And when I distill the buckets of opposition, they come in at three different levels. One is the opposition of the uninformed, individuals who have a reactionary attitude toward anything that is labeled psychedelic because of the pejorative associations that exist within their minds. That bucket of opposition is navigable once an individual is properly educated about what Ibogaine is and the fact that it is a very serious medication that also has a psychoactive effect with little to no recreational or party value when administered in conformity with its medical purpose. The second bucket of opposition is a little more informed, and it involves those who express concern about the cardiac risk and the propensity of Ibogaine to stop the heart. There again, that's navigable. When an individual can be shown the scientific reality that the co-administration of magnesium, complete with cardiac monitoring, screening, and the administration of stabilization medication like atropine can make the Ibogaine experience virtually risk-free from a cardiac perspective, assuming that you're with medical professionals who know what they're doing. The one bucket of opposition that is not navigable is that opposition that is anchored by the dollar bill of the pharmaceutical industry that feasts upon sustained human misery. And as it pertains to the opioid epidemic, the companies that created this catastrophe are also the companies that are on the back end making billions of dollars manufacturing its ostensible evidence-based best practice treatments. These companies have lined the pockets of public universities like the University of Kentucky. They've lined the pockets of Democrat politicians like Andy Beshear, the current Kentucky governor, and they've lined the pockets of Republican politicians like the current Kentucky Attorney General, who comes from the office of Senator Mitch McConnell. He was a student and protege of Senator McConnell. And Senator McConnell, as he gets ready to exit, is renowned for being a thoroughly machine-saturated politician whose monetary lifeblood has been the pharmaceutical industry that monetizes sustained human misery. That last bucket of opposition cannot be reasoned with. It cannot be negotiated with. It must be exposed and it must be beaten in the court of public opinion. And that is the only strategy that can be reasonably deployed and that's to educate and motivate the masses to put these folks in their place on the sidelines as progress is made.
Thank you, Bryan. Thinking back about Ibogaine going mainstream, uh, how do you envision balancing access for those who need it most, especially veterans and marginalized communities, without creating a psychedelic industrial complex that might be predatory? How do you see this balancing act of those in need with the profit corporations?
Well, the importance of the public dollar in this endeavor becomes clear in answer to your question. By virtue of the exercise of the public purse, we have the opportunity to exercise the sort of influence that can honor Ibogaine as the humanitarian asset that it should be. I think that most people are plenty sick and tired of seeing tax money confiscated through the force of government from working people, taken and handed over to powerful interests with no return on investment to the taxpayer, while the taxpayer bears the burden not just of the cost, but of the distortions that those very same recipients of public largesse create within their lives. So to that end, we have a singular opportunity to play multidimensional chess around Ibogaine. Not only do we aim to develop a breakthrough therapeutic that is one of a kind, but we have the opportunity to create a delivery system that addresses distortions within the U.S. healthcare system that create high access barriers directly related to high cost. The reality is that the money that it takes to create Ibogaine pills is not significant. The money that it takes to deliver the treatment through an effective model is expensive. But what we have is already expensive, exorbitantly so. There was a recent study that was issued, admittedly sponsored by a pharma company, which quantified that every individual in American society who has a diagnosable opioid use disorder carries a total companion economic cost of over $700,000. When we consider the fact that our existing addiction treatment system takes 120 days and over $108,000 just to bring a person to the point of stability where they will consistently take their Suboxone, we have the opportunity to dramatically bend both the time and cost curve in such a fashion as to redeploy financial savings to guarantee universal Ibogaine access for anyone who would choose to receive that treatment. But that's going to require constant vigilance every single day that we walk this path, because the wolves are always at our feet, ready to smash and grab whatever they can for their own consumption.
You have a wonderful way of characterizing the wolves at our doorstep, and you're very aware of it. Too often we forget that in our safe society. You also and Joe discussed Ibogaine can create a quote disruptive clarity in people's lives. So, what was the most striking transformation story that you witnessed that still gives you chills, goosebumps?
Oh, in full candor, Leonard, it would have to be my wife. I've known her for 24 years. She is a magnificent professional, accomplished alpha female. I've always known her as a left brain rationalist. She can burn me up in a math book any day of the week. She is someone who has always operated from the basis of rationality, sometimes to the total and complete exclusion of anything that you and I would recognize as a spiritual or mystical perspective that looks beyond the bounds of the material world. She had her son in 2021, and in the aftermath of his birth, she developed a significant postpartum depression. Whatever caused that left a residual behavioral disorder that frankly manifested itself as a psychotic mood disorder. If she did not take what came to be prescribed to her as a daily dose of Celexa, an SSRI, it was not safe to be around her. She was a danger to herself and others. We've been together now for 12 years, married for 9. And I could tell if her dosage was off or if she forgot to take a pill because of this glint in her eyes that conveyed an aggressive posture that would inevitably explode into a dangerous set of circumstances. When I initially became convicted that I needed to receive Ibogaine if I were going to be a credible advocate, I invited her to go along with me. By this time, I had had probably, 9 to a dozen psychedelic experiences, primarily around psilocybin, and she really had no interest in engaging in any of it. And she told me so. She said, I have no desire to do this. I'm not interested in any bit of it. But after she heard the Kentucky testimonies of individuals who had received the treatment in September of 23, she decided that she would have the experience, if for no other reason than to determine whether she could free herself of the need for SSRIs. So when we traveled down there in November of 23, it was a great question as to how she would respond. And I was frankly very concerned that if she had a bad experience, it very well may be so bad that it would jeopardize our relationship, because but for me, she wouldn't be doing this. After we came to the morning following receiving Ibogaine the night before, I was still laying down with my eyes closed. She came to my side and tapped my shoulder, and I pulled my eye mask off and looked up. And it was as if she had undergone a complete metamorphosis in the 12 hours that I had been under. The radiance of her face, the relaxation of those lines, those hard-bitten lines of the rationalist, the individual who had been tormented by a sense of unworthiness related to the saintly nature of her mother. Tears of joy streamed down her face, and she went ahead and as she described her story, I could not have possibly written or scripted a more beautiful experience for her than that which the plant provided. And the metamorphosis that began in November of 23 is one that continues to this day, and she is a transfigured individual.
Well, thank you for sharing that, Bryan. That's a deeply intimate and personal moment about Joalice. To see the beatific expression on her face coming out of that, as you both came out of that. Thank you for sharing that personal moment.
My joy.
But I have to move on to a rationalist line of questioning.
Go for it.
Sadly. So, what are the biggest myths about Ibogaine, or misunderstandings about Ibogaine that you, if you could, clear up or wish to clear up once and for all, what would those be?
The first would be that it is a medication that lends itself to individualized exploration. I would not ever wish to see Ibogaine delivered in anything that is not a clinically controlled medical setting for treatment of trauma, substance use, or other neurological disorders which require a medical framework for redress. It has to be administered by trained medical professionals who know exactly what they are doing in order to fully eliminate the possibility of lethality in connection with that cardiac risk. I would also add to that, many people, because of the way in which it gets grouped with psychedelic, think that it may have a recreational purpose, or that at some point it's going to be sold out of drugstores or in dispensaries, and we're going to have this underground Ibogaine reality that can add to all of the other street economy realities that can fray the social fabric. There is nothing about Ibogaine that lends itself to a recreational party vibe when it is administered through the flood dose, which is the primary method used by the clinics to treat trauma and addiction offshore from the United States. It creates a physical debility manifested by ataxia for 10 to 12 hours. Most folks experience profound nausea and will throw up several times throughout the experience. So, if somebody's idea of a good time is being semi-paralyzed and throwing up for 12 hours, they're going to have a blast. But if that's not your idea of a good time, you are going to be in for a rough ride physically. But the payoff on the other side, in my experience, has been well worth it. And I think finally, I would not necessarily describe this as a myth, but as a distortion. And it's one that I need to do a better job articulating publicly. Western society has a lot of vanity and conceit when it comes to the progress that it has produced through empirical frameworks. We've not done a good job when it comes to the ineffable and intangible spiritual realities that we can recognize. Societies that have been victimized by the West have had profound wisdom and knowledge around Ibogaine for many hundreds of years. And it is quite ironic to see societies that have been on the receiving end of westernized subjugation now be looked to receive not just the commodity, but assistance with the West's own self-strangulation in its debaucherous excesses. And there's a lot of irony there. There's a lot of opportunity there. And insofar as we can use the Ibogaine opportunity to heal not just individuals, but whole societies that have inflicted trauma in one direction or another, it's a real multi-lifetime opportunity to achieve some profound progress.
During the podcast with Joe, you mentioned that momentum is growing in Congress. And since that conversation, have you, other than Texas, have you seen any tangible policy shifts or promising developments that you can share that are not widely known?
So as we sit here and have this discussion, there have already been several bills introduced in different state legislatures to advance Ibogaine research and development in some shape, form, or fashion. Texas is the first and the most significant, but there were attempts in the state of West Virginia. There was legislation introduced in the state of Missouri. They did not successfully pass for reasons that were not necessarily related to Ibogaine, but other collateral policy issues that squeezed them out from consideration. This past week, the Ohio State Legislature passed and Governor DeWine signed a bill that will facilitate Ibogaine research there within the framework of Ohio State University. Arizona has passed a $5 million appropriation to fund a series of state phase 1 trials with Ibogaine for different neurological disorders that will be matched by a co-equal $5 million philanthropic contribution. We have interest in states of the Old South that include South Carolina, Tennessee, and Mississippi, as well as Georgia, places who have elected leaders, appointed officials, and aligned citizens of influence who wish to see their states join Texas as part of a voluntarily aligned multi-state coalition that can make Ibogaine the moonshot of our time. With all of the activity that is occurring in states outside of Texas, Governor Perry and I aim to leverage the organization that we lead, Americans for Ibogaine, in order to make it the shepherd which can guide all of this developing energy to the desired destination.
Well, thank you on that. If anyone can do it, you can do it. and you are doing it. It's the bravest political activity I've witnessed in my lifetime, frankly, and the great possible payoff. So all power to you both. Last general question, and maybe ask some two difficult policy questions. So when you look ahead 10 years or 20 years, what does success of this effort look like to you on a personal level and for the Ibogaine movement more broadly?
You know, Leonard, I've spoken about this experience as being a parable that illustrates larger truths. And while we're sitting here talking about Ibogaine, what we're really talking about is the future of American society, a society that has had its spiritual fabric riven and torn over the past 30 years in particular. This is a great civilizational restoration project. And with the recognition that the most profound problems that we have are expressed through those deaths of despair tied to drug overdose, alcohol-related disease, and suicide, three conditions that over the past 10 years have killed more people in America than all of the country's wars have killed its soldiers. We have got to begin the process of pollinating a fundamental change in direction for the American future. It's one that has to be reestablished on a spiritual foundation. And the only way that we're going to be able to do that is to create a fully operationalized substance use and mental health treatment system that is powered by the unique restorative properties of plant medicine broadly and other psychedelics more specifically to address mind, body, and soul. And if we can operationalize a system like that with Ibogaine as the first and most consequential medical beachhead to bring it to life, then we are going to plant the seeds for the mighty oak that will grow for decades to come. Because as each individual is restored, as each family is restored, as each community is restored, you will eventually restore the country.
What a grand vision. What a grand vision you have, and so many people around you have had, and those that you're influencing, especially in the power structures, have had. I discussed this future interview with some colleagues in Cambridge and in Bethesda, Baltimore, rather, at Harvard and Hopkins, and they have a couple of little tricky questions for you without divulging identities, but I'm sure you won't have any problem fielding them. But one was curious about potential pitfalls that you see with your approach. They know you're optimistic, but it would be helpful to them to hear if you've thought about what could go wrong with the initiative, what steps you might be taking to prevent an awkward outcome.
Well, I think that there are varying degrees of danger, and risk of failure is going to be attendant until we get to the end of the beginning. And in my opinion, the end of the beginning is an FDA approved Ibogaine medication that can be integrated into the U.S. healthcare system. That is the end of the beginning. And between here and there are multiple potentialities for failure. There is a failure of safety through the drug development process, where we have an adverse event that completely and totally torpedoes the ability to make this a reality. So we've got to make sure that the drug developer that is engaged in this knows exactly what they're doing, has the requisite background of expertise and sophistication to assure that that doesn't happen. There's a failure of political will, a failure of will to make sure that this project is resourced all the way to completion. Because what we don't want to have happen is to build a bridge halfway out into the water, only to leave it there without being able to get to the other side. There's the failure of just responsible and expeditious implementation. The wheels of government move slowly and inefficiently. And oftentimes you have to overcome any number of internal and external obstacles that aim to thwart the achievement of goals that are well defined within any given area of public policy. So being ever mindful of identifying those event adversaries, both in process and in external reality, is necessary to make sure that, to use the shepherd analogy, that we guard this opportunity with the utmost vigilance against those dangers, internal and external. That's a summary of those things that I see as high-level risk exposures for this project. Our goal, and I think the goal of many in the psychedelic movement, is to make the improbable inevitable. And there's a big bunch of walking and working and sweating and worrying and crying and wailing and gnashing of teeth and rejoicing that's going to occur between where we stand in the area of improbability and where we hope to arrive in terms of inevitability.
Well, you fielded that squirrely question quite well, I must say. Certainly a creative and wonderful response. Thank you, Bryan. From the same dear friend, anarchist in the Hopkins area, another question.
I like him.
Yes, I'll have to quote this because it's kind of difficult to say or paraphrase. So I'll just quote it. I'm curious about his thoughts on some of the big war machine money in the psychedelic space, like Peter Thiel, no offense, Peter, and whether mixing psychedelic medicine with an increasingly far-right government, especially in Texas, poses any risk. Can you wrap your mind around that question?
Well, I can. And I think that when we look at either end of the political spectrum, there are attendant dangers that exist on each end of those spectrums. You know, I hear the concern about the far right wing war machine. I think that's legitimate. In fact, just last night, Joe Allison and I were talking about the fact that, again, speaking to vigilance, you know, when it comes to Ibogaine, I can absolutely see the ambitious ulterior mind recognizing the opportunity to enhance the performance of the war machine by removing the spiritual essence of Ibogaine in favor of its materialist restoration of the mind and body, in order to essentially be able to repair the warfighter, to send them right back out in a condition of restoration to continue at a higher level the killing that their war trauma prevented them from doing before they were restored. I think just like anything that can be wielded by the human hand, it can be done for good or it can be done for bad. And I think that on the right, the way in which Ibogaine could be perverted to help and not just restore but enhance the war machine is something that we've got to be vigilant about recognizing and confronting if that becomes an emergent reality. On the left side, you know, if the right wing has a grand war machine, in my opinion, the political left has a beautiful subjugation machine that they like to deploy to create as many helpless and powerless people as they can, that rely upon the largesse of the government that they control for everything related to their basic needs. I think that psychedelics and the malleability that they produce within the human psyche to open up opportunities for those who have a messiah complex or a savior complex, I think that's a danger. And I think that the way that the left demigods its leaders for the purposes of creating as much social capture as possible is a danger that has to be looked at there.
Thank you, Bryan. And a question from another academic colleague in Cambridge at Harvard. And so I'll just do this question directly. How can Ibogaine treatment ever be scalable or really affordable? It's already a difficult problem to solve this scalability with psilocybin or LSD, but Ibogaine has an even longer duration in terms of difficulty being scalable or affordable. So relying upon philanthropy and scholarships is not really a satisfying answer to how to get this out there. Nor is relying on AI to design some hypothetical molecule with shorter duration.
Well, we have already achieved scalability through the systems that deliver Suboxone and Methadone. We have an immensely scaled addiction treatment infrastructure in this country. It's just that the therapeutics that are delivered through that system are ineffective 75% of the time. And I go back to the economics of what we have. The economics of what we have strangulate the ability to make meaningful progress when it comes to supplying the sort of long-term individual recovery support that is necessary to create an entirely different trajectory from where we've been. When a person comes into addiction treatment, the very first 30 days is all designed to get them off the street, get them clean, and get them to a point of coherence to where they can comply with their medical program, which is to take Suboxone every day. So that first 30 days inpatient is $36,000, and that's in 2022 Kentucky Medicaid dollars. I'm sure that price is adjusted upward since. And then for the next 90 days, a person goes in 3 times a week for counseling, for urinalysis, and for blood testing to assure compliance with the medication program that they're on, which is Suboxone and Methadone, opioids with which we treat opioid addiction. That next 90 days costs $72,000 per person. So for your initial 120 days of treatment, it costs $108,000. And that's just to get a person to where they are stable and able to be home by themselves without hopefully overdosing and perhaps getting to where they might be able to hold a job. They are still neurochemically impaired because their brain is dependent upon the opioid to stave off the onset of withdrawal. The average number of times a person will go through this process is 5. So we're talking about 120 days times 5, I think that's 600 days and $540,000. That is the infrastructure we have. So my answer to the question is, Ibogaine presents us with an opportunity to achieve substantial improvement in both time and money efficiency that will see a significant savings on both if we can replace the wholesaler, which is the methadone and Suboxone supplier, with the Ibogaine wholesaler, with our existing treatment and recovery infrastructure as the retailer of those therapeutics, to borrow an economic model.
Well, thank you, Bryan. That certainly addresses the difficult question about scalability and affordability. You have a displacement, a replacement of a massive infrastructure that has existed for decades and not working with something that is much more effective and does work. So last question from Cambridge. Some believe FDA will never approve Ibogaine due to its cardiac risk. Why are they wrong?
Well, we have formal public testimony on this question that was taken in Kentucky in October of 23. When I ran the commission, the University of Kentucky demanded a hearing explicitly on the question of the FDA's willingness to approve Ibogaine, because it was their position that you just articulated from your colleague, that there is no circumstance under which the FDA would ever approve this because of the cardiac risk. We were able to bring in the Scientist General for Controlled Substances Research, who at that time was Dr. Javier Munez, as well as Dr. Walter Dunn, who serves on the FD's Board of Neuropharmacology, and I believe he is still there. Both of those gentlemen, before they even received the first question, began their introductory statements jointly by saying, "We have repeatedly heard folks on this commission assert that the FDA will never approve Ibogaine or an Ibogaine trial because of the existence of a cardiac risk." And they flatly stated categorically that that position is not true. And they said for the FDA, the question is not whether there is a risk, because there are a multitude of medications that carry high and substantial risk, all the way up to and including the loss of life. The question is whether the risk can be safely mitigated. And if the answer to that question is yes, then there is no reason why the FDA would not ultimately approve not just the trial, but Ibogaine as a medication itself. Now, that is the answer to that question. If we are able to demonstrate through the FDA drug development process that Ibogaine can be safely administered and that it has efficacy for the conditions for which it's being developed, it's going to be approved.
Thank you, Bryan. It brings back the idea of there are many drugs that are extremely toxic and require daily monitoring by a physician, but not as toxic as death from the illness. In this case, Ibogaine's difficult aspects with the cardiotoxicity in 1 of 200 or 300 people may be offset by the likelihood of death from addiction. So I think your point is well stated and directly on point. And
I would add one other little fact that is relevant, and that is, FDA methadone, of course, is FDA approved. The United States clocks almost 4,000 methadone deaths a year. And I don't hear anyone talking about taking methadone out of the clinics because it kills people at a scale that I cannot begin to touch.
And aspirin kills even more, but it's entrenched in American society and will be with us always. So thank you, Bryan. This at least concludes our formal inquiry in support of JLS, sponsored by JLS. And Bryan and I could talk for hours or days or years, and likely will, but we do have a limit today. And I simply want to thank you, Bryan, for your great heart and your great courage and your vision and your endurance in spearheading this effort. I cannot imagine a lesser man, which is most people, handling this in the charismatic and earnest and enduring way that you do. All honor to you, Bryan. And thank you, dear friends, for listening to this.
Make me cry.
Now, those that would like to hear some juicier questions, in order to keep the lights on, we have a shorter Patreon podcast in which Bryan and I get into some of the deeper, more way out aspects. And that's at patreon.com/the_last_alchemist. So we'll close this for JLS today. And if you go to Patreon, The Last Alchemist, you'll hear some more wild and wonderful tales from this extraordinary and blessed brother in arms, Bryan Hubbard. And thank you, everyone.